Hi, so my name is Gretchen Moretti, and for the last 4 months as a senior at Michigan State University, I have been researching the treatment of interned Japanese Americans and captured German and Italian troops during World War II. So, when I was in high school in rural Wyoming, I took a Holocaust literature class, and surprisingly, the one statement that stuck with me the most was from our discussion of Nazis. My teacher was telling us, these were normal men. Some of them were kept in a prisoner of war camp here in Wyoming and worked in the sugar beet farms outside of Lovell. They lived here and we liked them. And that brought my brain to a screeching halt. They were here? How many? Why did no one talk about that? We were all aware of the historical significance of our area during that time period because my hometown was chosen as the location of a Japanese internment camp. But Nazis? Nazis were a whole new thing. How did the community rationalize having those two groups so close together? And why did they like the prisoners, but seemingly not like the Japanese Americans? And my teacher, being the excellent teacher she was, softly replied that she didn't know. But I could not just leave it there. That was so dissatisfying. So I went to college and I researched, and now I feel like I can finally answer some of my own questions about why these two groups were treated differently by the surrounding populations, what this treatment reveals about ideas of race, citizenship, and belonging historically, and how this can be useful in understanding contemporary politics and social attitudes. So, for a brief historical context, America entered World War II on December 7, 1941, following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, the first ever foreign attack on American soil. And it is really impossible to overstate the political and social importance of Pearl Harbor because here's the thing about America. Even before, but especially during and after 1941. Societally, we did not like the Japanese. As a foreign entity and definitely not as citizens in our own country. They were allowed to come, but once Japanese Americans, they were expected to speak our language, eat our foods, and wear our clothes. It did not matter if they became citizens or even had been here for generations. They were outsiders, and now potentially dangerous outsiders at that. Pearl Harbor gave us the perfect xenophobic excuse to relocate more than 110,000 men, women, and children of Japanese heritage under the orders of President Roosevelt to interior internment camps throughout the United States as a matter of national security. Additionally, with the United States joining the fight on the European front, prisoner of war camps began to be erected throughout the country to relieve the pressures on camps in the UK. In December of 1942, the United States government sent a team of engineers and surveyors to a 687-acre parcel of land near Douglas, Wyoming. Construction on the site began in February of 1943, with the first prisoners arriving that summer, and by early fall, over 2,000 prisoners of German and Italian descent resided within the state. Right up the road, literally within a 4-hour drive of Camp Douglas, was a Japanese-American internment camp called Heart Mountain. It was also right near my hometown of Powell, Wyoming, and it was constructed as a 46,000-acre self-sufficient compound to house over 10,000 Japanese Americans. Now, the Japanese Americans interned in Heart Mountain clearly felt that this was not their home. They did not belong in Wyoming. Despite the fact that this was true in a very real physical sense, because they were uprooted from their homes to be sent to relocation camps, it was also true in a deeply social sense. A young man, Iichi Sakauye, was relocated from San Jose, California, all the way to the Heart Mountain internment camp. He was an avid videographer, and one of the few belongings he insisted on bringing with him was his camera. Once arrived and settled into the camp, he began to take video footage of the life inside. All of his surviving videos are archived along with a commentary by Sakauye himself explaining what is happening in the various film shots. Right off the bat, there is a brief scene of several children sledding down a large embankment as camp buildings loom in the background. He explains the Caucasian personnel's youngsters had enjoyed themselves sledding, down one of the slopes. The Japanese people did not have the privilege of having skis or sleds. And this statement really begins to illustrate the social separation that was felt by the interned populations, because in every instance referring to white personnel, Sakauye specifically mentions the color of their skin, even with children. Further along in the footage, Sakauye had received special permission to film a Boy Scout ceremony taking place in the high school gym within the camp. Dozens of beaming children are marching in formation, wearing uniform and saluting the American flag. Sakauye sadly states, "All along we were American citizens, expressing our patriotism, but the rights of American citizens were denied," before lapsing into silence for the rest of the ceremony sequence. And the surrounding population definitely echoed the sentiment of separation and distance, and largely it was simply by not being there. As I previously mentioned, the camp was self-sufficient and thus hugely isolated. One of the only examples of a contact point is the periodical newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel. This paper, which is archived issue by issue for the entirety of its 3-year run, contained some news from the surrounding areas which spoke directly to the outside community's opinions of the camp's occupants. One particular issue, from September 4th, 1943, is emblazoned with the headline, "Wyoming Legion Backs Evacuees," which initially is pretty promising. Unfortunately, the rest of the article goes on to detail the group's support of Japanese-American only as it pertains to use in the national war effort by, quote, "affording employment and opportunity for Japanese-American evacuees to serve." As Otto Frisbee, a delegate of the Powell branch of the Legion, explains, "The fortunes of war have placed approximately 110,000 people of Japanese birth or descent into relocation centers, and these people are American citizens. It is resolved that these people be afforded every fair and reasonable opportunity to work and contribute to the needs of the nation." So, unfortunately, in the eyes of the public, these individuals were simply bodies. Bodies for national use by a country who would only recognize their citizenship when it was convenient. Unfortunately, also, not long after this article, Japanese American men were added to the mandatory drafting of troops to the military. Now, while the Japanese American experience was marked with segregation, prisoners of war had a remarkably different experience during their time in Wyoming. One major difference in the treatment of these two groups is that while the Japanese Americans were concentrated in a single self-sufficient area, prisoners of war were split up and sent out to satellite camps originating around their home base in Douglas, Wyoming. One such camp was in Clearmont, located on the outskirts of Sheridan and a mere 2-hour drive from the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. Prisoners were sent here largely to assist with the farming of sugar beets in the local community. While out working, prisoners were allowed a fairly high degree of interaction with the families they worked for, and this resulted in a fairly strong and amiable bond being formed. Indeed, even after the war ended, some of these prisoners, upon being freed, chose to stay in the area, with 2 even marrying into families with whom they had worked. Others returned to Germany but would write letters and occasionally even return for visits. One such letter from former prisoners to families in the Clearmont area have been preserved. One such letter is from Herman Eckert to the Fowler family. He addresses the letter to Mr. Fowler and begins by discussing his recent marriage and return to Germany. He notes the hardships present in Germany following the war, specifically lack of food, stating that while living in Wyoming he weighed 175 pounds and now he weighs 130. Herman goes on to explain that the fond memories of his time spent in Wyoming are what keep him smiling. He writes, "I keep smiling like I was when I was staying with you. It gives me pleasure to think of the time when I was working with you in the sweet beets. At that time, I was feeling like a free man. I was well off, even though I was a prisoner of war. If I were allowed, I would not hesitate to immigrate to the USA. Signed, gratefully yours, Herman Eckert." From the perspective of Rose Fowler herself, who was the wife of Mr. Fowler and also a homesteader in the Clermont area during World War II, the prisoners were a valued addition to the community. She begins her interview testimony by stating, "The German prisoners proved to be a real help." According to the available transcript of the discussion, she goes on to laud these men for being cheerful, friendly, and polite workers. Interestingly, she is also quick to humanize them and to point to skills they had beyond simply being prisoners, soldiers, or even just farmhands. She says, "Some had a very good education. They were artisans and skilled in many types of work. Albert Knaus was a talented pianist. He ate lunch hurriedly so that he could play. He entertained all of us." For Rose, these men were not individuals purely defined by their status as Germans or even as prisoners. And indeed, this accommodating view of these men was widespread throughout the community. The earlier waves of Italian prisoners contained many talented artists who painted frescoes in the important buildings within the camps and the homes of more wealthy members of the surrounding communities. Many of these murals have been purposefully preserved and can be viewed to this day. On the last day of work, Rose gathered all of her boys together for a picture, which following the war she mailed to as many of the men as she had addresses for and kept as a memento for herself. So this is actually a picture of all of the prisoners who worked with the Fowler family in Clermont. So why does this matter? Why am I dredging archives for these long forgotten stories aside from just my own personal interest? Because within these stories are patterns and intersections that matter. Some of the most prolific heavy hitters in social and political theory have set the precedent for drawing these connections. For example, Benedict Anderson, in his widely read and respected work, Imagined Communities, acknowledges that there is a clear link between citizenship, which is understood to be a political concept that defines an individual's relationship to a state and the rights subsequently afforded to them as a result of this relationship. So, there is a clear link between this citizenship and belonging. Belonging being a sense that there's validation that stems from the full and fair participation in one's nation. W.E.B. Du Bois, another buzz name, intrinsically ties race to belonging and citizenship by explaining the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. This problem, as Du Bois identifies it, is one of systematic differential treatment. Furthermore, as indicated by this statement, a basic understanding of race is simply the visually discernible physical differences between various ethnic groups, with the subjectivity of that definition being a huge part of the problem. Using these theorists, the connections they've made and the definitions they've provided of race, citizenship, and belonging, the specific intersections that Hart Mountain and Camp Douglas detail become even more significant and fascinating. To me, one important theme of these narratives is the understanding that prisoners of war were complete people with personalities, usable skills, and talents, while the Japanese Americans were just that, Japanese. As I mentioned previously, a number of the Italian prisoners were talented artists and painted several still preserved murals in camp buildings and in community homes. Additionally, there is record that prisoners played music to entertain families, put on plays for the public, and one even coached a local sports team. Meanwhile, the Japanese Americans were not as consistently interacted with. Professionals among the Japanese population, of which there were many, were only allowed to offer their services within the camp. Even when the Japanese Americans were allowed to work, they were sent to the state of Washington as usable labor. They did not stay in the local community because they did not belong and they were not wanted, even for help that was clearly needed. The Japanese Americans were understood to be an entity atop a hill. They were societally viewed as a group, an indistinguishable mass of Japanese bodies. The prisoners of war were individual men with names, with personalities, men who could be talked to and who could come to belong. It is difficult to find the space for 11,000 foreigners to belong. Citizenship was another point of frustration and oppression. It was powerfully and explicitly explained by Eiichi Sakaue that those interned in the Heart Mountain internment camp were aware that their rights as United States citizens were being infringed upon. They did feel that they were entitled to better treatment by virtue of their legal belonging to this country. Indeed, many did point to their citizenship status as a way to access these increased rights, but were wholly ignored. And thus manifests the final factor of race. Because the differences in this sense of belonging cannot be attributed to any wrongdoings or even perceived wrongdoings on the part of Japanese Americans. Because those interned were elderly, women, and children, and yet still vilified as enemies. Conversely, the young men who were proven and captured foreign enemies were accepted as brothers. So really, what it all boils down to is this. The prisoners of war were more readily accepted and integrated because they were not racially different than the local people. They did not have any outward signifiers of foreignness. Their white skin afforded them a sense of belonging that was not felt by Japanese Americans despite their literal legal belonging to this country. Race was categorically prioritized over citizenship. And the truly troubling reality that examining these experiences of race, citizenship, and belonging reveal is that we did not learn from our mistakes. Pearl Harbor stood for almost 60 years as the deadliest attack on U.S. territory, only to be usurped by the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. Not only are these attacks similar in that they were foreign attacks on American soil, as well as horrific in magnitude, but they both opened the door for the unabashed discrimination of a minority group on the grounds of national security. Anti-Arab American rhetoric within the United States is at an all-time high, with general attitudes of xenophobia and distaste for immigrants also reaching widespread acceptability. Much like the precedent the internment of Japanese Americans give us, the citizenship of these individuals is being wholly disregarded on the grounds of their race, ethnicity, or religion. They are all visualized and perpetualized as a dangerous entity separate from American society. And that has to stop. I am not claiming that Arab Americans are being mass interned in camps and treated worse than war prisoners. Although we could do that, we have gone there. I am saying that their rights to belonging as citizens of this country are being disregarded due to the visual difference their race provides. As was the case with the Japanese Americans, sensitivity to identifying individuals of this race has arisen out of the national trauma of 9/11, and the discriminatory xenophobic rhetoric and logic is being rationalized as national security. What we are failing to realize and learn is that while these people may not share the color of our skin, they are our nation too. And the rights and sense of belonging that should come with being an American, regardless of any additive identities, be it Japanese, Arab, Mexican, you name it, should not be subverted to the ignorant, panicked discrimination of racial difference. The testimonies through this research give us a chance to recognize the repetition of history and stop it before we again upend everything this nation stands for by prioritizing race over citizenship rights. Thank you, and if you would like any further information, further testimonies, a complete list of my sources, please visit the website prisonersofrace, prisonersofwar.webnode.com. Thank you very much.